Our pursuit of balanced and equitable development brought about immense prosperity for our people. It was judiciously developed by the state to strengthen our economy and benefit the nation and people at large. His Majesty the King. Kuzombola, welcome to your UN House and to the 30th session of Bhutan Dialogues. I want to start today with some statistics. As of today, there have been over 14,000 views on YouTube of the 29 Bhutan Dialogues that have already happened. We have done recently 3 live streams on Facebook, like we're doing today, and have averaged 3,500 people per live stream. COVID is a challenge, but we are stepping up with the technology. COVID has been described as the biggest challenge to humanity since World War II, which closed with the foundation of the United Nations. As the world struggles through this COVID battle, I am deeply moved by how Bhutan has once again come together in solidarity. His Majesty the King's leadership inspires and encourages every Bhutanese to come together to combat COVID. I wish to also commend the Royal Government of Bhutan in focusing on both the immediate responses to this pandemic and also the longer-term recovery measures. The Royal Government of Bhutan's decision to continue working on the 21st century economic roadmap personifies leadership in action. Our topic today is the role of private sector in Bhutan's economic development. We often say the private sector is the engine of growth. And we say this because successful businesses drive growth, create jobs and pay the taxes that finance services. For example, they help with keeping our education and health sectors strong. Today's Bhutan Dialogues will help us look at the opportunities and the challenges within Bhutan's private sector and add to the discussion of ensuring the country is deliberately shaping its destiny in this, the 3rd decade of the 21st century. Our speaker today is Dasho Ugen Tsechup Dorji, the chairperson of Zimdra, vice chair of the Singye group. Dasho has started a number of businesses in cement, ferroalloys, automobile distribution, mining, ferrosilicon, fruit juice and milk processing. He is Consul General of Thailand to Bhutan, President of Commerce and Industry in Bhutan, and President to Bhutan Football Federation. Our host, Dr. Karma Phuntsho, is the founder of Lopen Foundation. Dr. Karma is currently the Deputy Chairperson of the team spearheading the development of Bhutan's 21st century economic roadmap. My closing. Please drop your questions in the chat box. Please keep them short and to the point. Sarin Chuki will be reviewing the questions and reading them aloud when the time is right. Allow me to end with a quote from the Secretary General of the UN. Building the road is the first step towards prosperity. The United Nations system stands ready to travel this road with you in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and to fulfill our promise to leave no one behind. Tashi Dele, and thank you.
Dasho, welcome to the 30th session of Bhutan Dialogues. We had to sadly call off the last session when you were supposed to be here because of the lockdown. So we are living in very difficult, challenging times. And at such challenging times, it calls us to have bold new thoughts, actions and plans. And here at Bhutan Dialogues, that's what we try to promote, a culture of bold thinking, of mindful listening and right speech. So it's a great honor for us to have you here because I personally know you as a very incisive, bold thinker, very vocal, articulate speaker, and also a doer. So it's a great pleasure for us to have you. To begin with, Dasho, I want to ask you a very simple, immediate question. We had just come out of our phased lockdown period. What did you think of this lockdown phase? It's an unprecedented experience for all of us. What did you do to make the best of it?
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to thank Gerald and Doctor for having me over to speak on Bhutan Dialogues. I have been following all the YouTube sessions and I found them all very, very interesting. And I couldn't wait to actually come here and speak to you all about something that is near and dear to my heart, which is the role of the private sector in the development process of our nation. When it comes to the COVID and the lockdown, actually for me, it gave me a lot of time to be with myself, most importantly, and also to be with my family. How I spent the 21 days of lockdown, I caught up on my art, because I like to draw,
Nice.
but I've never had the time to relax and to draw. So I did a few pieces of artwork. I also got to start some meditation practices that I was looking forward to doing with the help of my wife. Of course, I did take some time out to exercise and a lot of self-reflection as to where we are, where we should go. And I think for me, it was actually quite enjoyable session to me.
Yes.
21 days is not a very long time. And at the same time, I got to see the on TV, we were watching the role of the volunteers. So that actually also brought about a sense of pride, sense of being proud that we had such people in our society that were willing to come out and volunteer their services during times of difficulty.
Nice. I hope we'll get to see some of your art in the future. But we often start this session asking our guests to say a little bit about his or her life, especially highlighting the milestones, the chapters that shaped your career, your personality, and you are, to most Bhutanese, a very well-known, established businessman. What made you a businessman? And has this COVID chapter actually made you rethink about your career and your direction in the future?
Well, to answer your second question first, Doctor, no. It has not made me rethink. In fact, it has made it more, the resolution to be a better businessman actually, because of the COVID situation, because you suddenly find out the importance of the private sector in situations like this, and we need a vibrant private sector. So it actually strengthened my resolve to be a better businessman. On what shaped me to be a businessman, I call myself an accidental businessman. I think we all grew up at a time when there was no real sort of environment where we had business role models. There was nobody that we looked up to as a businessman said, I want to emulate him, I want to be like him. There was nobody in the civil service at that point of time that we were in awe of. I think the only person that all of us were in awe of was His Majesty the Fourth King. He was our hero, he was everything to us. And so therefore there was no defined environment which I could associate myself to say that, okay, because of this I've become this. So I don't think, I was just pushed into it. We are a family of 9 children, 6 sisters and 3 brothers. My 2 brothers opted to be civil servants. So I suppose my father was left with no choice but to say, look, you're not going anywhere, you're taking over the business. So in that light, choice of a businessman was made for me by my father. But on what I became, how I went about doing my business, I think that was defined by my late father. I think he was not much of a man with his words. So he wouldn't sit me down and give me lectures and give me lessons and tell me about life and business, but through his actions, through how he went about doing his work. There were few things that he taught me, and one of the most important things that he taught me was don't compete with others. He says always be appreciative of good work that is done by others. Be happy for others' success. The only person you need to compete is with yourself. So every day, better yourself. Today, 1 step, tomorrow 2 steps. So that's what you should strive for. So I think that is how everything came about. The other thing also is that, we were never exposed to an environment by my parents where we were made to feel that I need to strive to do something, you know. So I need to be a Dasho, or I need to, you know, be a really successful businessman, because the environment was, let's just say, very sheltered for us. You know, the problems, I'm sure, when I reflect back on life of a businessman, I'm sure my father had a lot of problems financially, with businesses not working out. But that was never ever, you know, portrayed to us. So he never made us feel that pressure, that stress, that I need to do something for my family, or I need to make myself stronger to do something. So it was just, like I said, and I don't think I'm special or different. I think every person in my generation actually went about in that manner. And it was at the end of their education, and when they came back to Bhutan, that they were thrust into something. But it wasn't out of choice, it should have been.
But I don't know if many people would have had the kind of source of inspiration that Dasho you find in your father. I mean, Gyalpo was a larger-than-life figure. A lot of people were inspired by him. And it is very interesting how Dasho points out that single most inspiration you got from him is not to compete with others. I think in Bhutan, we often have this conflict, you know, the tension between the Buddhist values of being content, not wanting to compete, but then again the business environment where you have to compete to an extent. And people don't necessarily see competition as competition against yourself or your past, but they always sort of target it towards the others. So in real practice, Dasho, did you find it easy to just compete with yourself and not compete with others? Or is it a very difficult thing to practice?
This is something that I've maintained throughout my life.
Yes.
I'm not envious of other people's success.
Yes.
I'm not jealous of people's success. I don't want something because somebody else has it. You know, so that's never been a part of my thinking, my philosophy.
Yes.
And I think from a very young age, that is something that was one of the important lessons that my late father taught me, was that, you know, by you being upset with his success doesn't make you more successful. You know, his success was good for him. Be happy for him. You know, measure your success with, you know, under your own terms. So I think I've never, honestly, when you asked me this question, there was a brief moment of self-reflection, and I asked myself that question internally, and I truly believe that I've not competed with anybody else except myself.
This is wonderful, Dasho, because I think as we go forward, talking about the economy and about boosting the private sector, one of the most important values would be that we cooperate and collaborate rather than compete against each other. I think a pure neoliberal capitalist approach of cutthroat businesses, so competing doesn't sound very good for Bhutan in the future. So Dasho, now if we go to our theme today, you have been in private sector for so long, but as part of the economic task force team, I've been working with people, listening to people, getting their opinions. There seems to still be a lot of reluctance on part of the state to really make the private sector sort of happen in the real sense. There seems to be a tension between whether we want to have a state-driven capitalism or a free market capitalism. I think most people are clear about having a capitalist model to boost the economy, but there seems to be that tension among lots of people. What do you think should be Bhutan's position? What should it opt for? As it is, it seems that the state really wants to have the greater control of things. But then it's also stuck with issues like unemployment, where there's no other way but help the private sector grow to solve this problem. Which direction should we go?
Doctor, I think there's a time for everything. And there was a role for the state to be involved in business. When the private sector in Bhutan was nascent, when the private sector in Bhutan was not, the capacity was not there to invest and do businesses, they were more familiar with trading and barter system rather than manufacturing, production, industries. And of course, a lot of other businesses that you see now. So there was a time, and at that appropriate time, I think the government did get involved.
Yes.
In fact, the government was of huge assistance to the private sector, where they actually involved themselves in helping private sector set up businesses. They took up 80% of the equity, allowed the private sector to actually manage the business, even though they were the minority share. So there was this structure in place. And at that point of time, that was what was needed. I think in the 6th 5-year plan, under His Majesty the Fourth King, who through his vision saw that private sector is going to be the true engine of growth. You know, that will shoulder the responsibility of income generation and employment generation. So at that point of time, there was this concerted effort under His Majesty's leadership to slowly start divesting in SOEs, slowly allowing private sector. So if you look at in the early 90s, tourism was totally given to the private sector. If you look at the transport sector, before it was called Bhutan Government Transport Service, BGTS, that also slowly, if you look at today, you have every sector from Dzongkhag to Dzongkhag, local transportation, everything being handled by private sector. That was because of the direction given by His Majesty that these sectors' capacity is developed in the private sector, so we should move on to private sector. Then if you look at the construction sector, bridge and roads were made exclusively by PWD, Public Works Division. But then that too was then again slowly divested, and private sector was involved in doing that business. Commercial activities, essential goods supplies, wholesale, car business, everything was slowly given to the private sector. So that was actually the way that the government started thinking, the state started thinking. Sadly to say that when the semi-political structure started taking place, and eventually then the political democracy came about, I don't know what changes took place. I don't know whether there was a rethink on the importance of having revenue in their own hands rather than having revenue generated by the private sector, where it gave maybe the politicians or the government more control on how the expenses was done. I don't know the thinking. At that point of time, suddenly construction, you started CDCL, you started the State Mining Corporation, you started a whole host of SOEs. I think the intention of the government under His Majesty's, the Fourth King's leadership was state should be in the role of regulating and formulating policies. You have the example, you can't ask a doctor to design a house, and you can't ask an engineer to operate on a person. No, each has its own responsibility and its own things that they should do. So therefore, I feel that the state should not be involved in business. State should be involved in regulating and formulating policies.
But if you look at the current scenario, you have DHI, which is a very big player in the economy, and since 2008 or so, they have grown by 365% or so, as we hear. And then we have many other SOEs that are not within DHI. So what would the private sector actually suggest be the role of the state? What changes should the state make in terms of not perhaps infringing or coming in too much into the area that the private sector is best working?
But Doctor, if you look at DHI, and if you look at the Royal Charter, which is actually on the website, that is a very visionary charter. Under the Fifth King, His Majesty, Royal Charter is very visionary. It is actually in keeping with what should happen. So sometimes I feel that the DHI management should read that charter once every maybe month or a week, because the charter is very clear. It says that DHI's role and responsibility. In fact, in every annex, in every chapter, in every clause, there's at least a mention about how DHI should support private sector, complement private sector, develop private sector. Their responsibilities is to build brand Bhutan image. Their responsibility is to actually look at government policies and see what policies are not conducive to the progression of private sector, and actually take leadership and dialogue with the government to move things ahead. Their responsibility is to invest outside Bhutan. Theirs is to go where no man has gone before, like you have in the Star Trek this thing more beginning.
Yes,
So the leadership of DHI is to be able to do something progressive that is beyond the capacity of the business people within Bhutan. Once the capacity build-up is there, then move on, hand that over to the private sector, and move on to bigger things. I think that is the role that DHI should be playing. And if we've always maintained that we actually welcome DHI as a leader to the private sector. We will look up to them. We would want to partner them. We want them to help and assist us. But like I said, sometimes the visions of our leaders and sometimes the people who implement, there's a little bit of a mismatch there.
So, Dasho, you think they should be more into strategic business areas, leave much more room to the private sector? But then, let me be the voice of people who oppose let's say the paramount role of private sector in the national economy. I think one of the arguments we often hear is that the public sector can do as good as the private sector would do to run a specific business. And in fact, if it's run by a public sector company, then the profits remain with the state,
Yes.
which means it remains with the people. And so most of the people who I've talked to, especially representing the public institutions, the state enterprise, would say, why should we opt for a private owner when a public institution or a SOE can do as good as well a job and then deliver the profits to the state?
Yes. I think that's a very interesting argument made by the government. I think they would have to argue that way.
There are some economists who also argue that way.
No, but I don't. I tend to, like I said, I'm one of those persons that I prefer if it was with the private sector, but I don't oppose SOEs because what we've always maintained is that as long as the playing field is level,
so equal opportunity.
as long as both the SOE and the private sector get equal opportunity, where government is not giving handouts, government is not giving grants, government is not giving low-cost financing to the SOE, and the private sector that is in the same field has to compete not at a level playing field. So that is one thought that I have. But the other side, the other argument is that SOEs, when they generate profits, and that is if they generate profits, stays in the hand of the government similar. I agree. But the private sector that do similar type of businesses, that the SOEs are doing, is very limited. I think there's this perception of generalizing that private and public SOE means every strand of business and every sector. The places where SOEs are involved is very, very minimal, and also the private sector that is involved to the level of where SOEs are involved is very minimal. You can count them on your fingertips. The revenue that is generated by the private sector, first of all, is paid to the government in form of taxes. So there is revenue for the government. It's not that there's no revenue for the government. Secondly, there are indirect taxes paid to the government in forms of the through the fueling stations, through transportation, through rental income. So there's, Doctor, you know what the downstream benefits are to private sector development. And the other side is that these companies that are promoted at the same level as of SOEs is not 100% owned by private individuals. It's promoters plus public. So at least when the promoter or the public makes some income, what happens to that income? It goes into the system. I don't lock it up in my cupboard or put it under my bed. I go to a shop, buy things, I buy a car, I buy cement, I go and buy grocery products. So there's a distribution of this wealth in the economy. When the public sector makes this money, what does it go into? It goes into salary. It goes into maintenance of infrastructure, current expenses. But it doesn't go into the hands of the people. Because we don't have a welfare system where we give money more to people. A welfare system is free education and free health. But we don't have social social security where we give out monthly stipend to people.
Yes.
We don't have that system. So because of that, when the public sector makes and generates income, that money goes to the government, no doubt. But it goes into certain other sectors which the government deems important. But at the same time, this money doesn't go to the farmers. It doesn't go to the people in the rural or urban areas. So I'm very balanced in my thinking when it comes to SOE participation. It's good. If you look at Bhutan Telecom, they're doing very well. They're competing equally with a private company, but they're on a level playing field. So we're not saying that public sector cannot perform well. Look at Druk. You have Tashia, you have Druk. Druk is performing very well. So we're not saying that public sector cannot do well. But what we're saying is that as long as it is on a level playing field, it shouldn't be like CDCL, where they're doing a lot of the government construction, but it is all on work order basis, where they don't have to compete equally on an equal footing with the other contractors. So things like that is not very encouraging for the private sector.
I think the argument for equal opportunities, Dasho, that is very convincing, that whether it is a public SOE or a private company, the rules, the sort of conditions should apply equally. And if a private company could contribute more revenue to the state, perhaps, for instance, thinking of the border company, business that was in news recently, I'm not quite sure how that worked out, but it almost sounded to me as if there was no equal opportunities for the private and the public to take part in the auctions and compete for the businesses. But one of the other concerns, Dasho, I heard is that often people who are representing the state says our private sector is still a fledgling. It's not ready to take up big businesses. What's your thought on that?
Doctor, you can only make that remark
Yes.
If you've given them the opportunity and they failed in it. You cannot assume.
Yes.
Assumptions should not be made. That, I don't think you're capable. So therefore, I will not give you the opportunity. If you've given me the opportunity and I've failed in my commitment, then you can say these people have failed and they're not capable of doing this. And you cannot also generalize because of individual cases. Because I'm quite confident that the private sector, if you see the growth of the private sector in the last decade, I think they've grown considerably.
Yes.
The amount of responsibilities they've taken up, the amount of jobs they've created, the amount of diversification that has taken place in the market through the private sector, and the challenges they've taken up, I think is immense. So I don't think it's proper to make assumptions that we cannot give the opportunity to private sector because they're still nascent, they're still small, they're still not professional. Because unless and until you put the challenge out and say, can you deliver? So that is why there was this, I'm sure all of us have heard this joke that has been made all the time. Whenever there was this comment that government officials used to make the comment that private sector is the engine of growth. There'd be a small whisper amongst all the private people, yes, but without the fuel.
There's something similar I heard also, that a foreign expert who comes to Bhutan regularly, he's said a remark that if given the option, Bhutan actually would prefer not to have the private sector. So that's the kind of sort of mood perhaps the public or state institutions are still in, unfortunately. But then when you look at the private sector, Bhutan Chamber of Commerce and Industries is supposed to be the apex representing the private sector. And even BCCI has been sort of faltering in some ways. Dasho, you have been the president, so what has gone wrong? What can be done to boost the private sector through BCCI, or BCCI become a very strong representative of the private sector?
Doctor, what you've said is absolutely true. That the Bhutan Chamber of Commerce, till now, has not been taken seriously. During pre-democracy, it was taken seriously. Bhutan Chamber of Commerce was always a part of discussions with the government. The Bhutan Chamber of Commerce had a member in the parliament. 1988 was when His Majesty issued a royal charter and a kajala that BCCI should start. It was actually in the early 80s that BCCI was formed, but it had become defunct for a couple of years. And in 1988 again, His Majesty said, no, chamber is very important, integral part of development of our country. Private sector is important. Chamber needs to be revived. And chamber was revived now. There was a lot of importance given under the presidentship of Dasho Ugen Dorji. There was a lot of consultation process. And at that time, the Chamber of Commerce was very vibrant. But like I said, I don't know if it seems I'm blaming everything on democracy now, which is not my intention. Which is not my intention, but it seems as if the series of events have almost led to things like that. I think at that point of time, suddenly there was this need for everyone to set up associations. So you have the Tourism Association, you have the Hotel Association, you have the Traders Association, you have the Automobile Association, you have 14 or 15 associations. And Bhutan being such a small country, first of all, with a small population, and at the same time having even a smaller private sector, we had a huge amount of representation where people suddenly said, why do I need the chamber? If I'm a tour operator, I don't need to go to the Chamber of Commerce anymore. I'm going to go direct to my association. My association president is going to go directly to the minister or to the prime minister and then have his issues resolved. So I think that was one of the reasons that sort of created the ineffectiveness of the Bhutan Chamber of Commerce. Secondly, I think there was also fault from the Bhutan Chamber of Commerce because we became a very reactive organization. And during my tenure, we tried to change that to becoming a proactive. But just as an information, Doctor, I resigned 3 months before my term was over, because in actually objection to the way that the government was treating the Bhutan Chamber of Commerce. 2.5 years of my time I spent as chamber president, compiling issues, compiling the way forward, compiling cross-cutting issues and changes that might have to be brought about in the departments and ministries to actually give fuel to the private sector and to truly become the engine of growth. But it was ignored. We requested for several meetings with the government, it was ignored. So finally, in frustration, 3 months prior to my term being over, I resigned. So I agree with you that the Chamber of Commerce has not been seen. But I must profess here today that the present government has given a lot of importance to Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber of Commerce is, as Doctor is aware, being consulted for the 21st Century Way Forward program also, and we feel very much a part of the process of development now.
So, Dasho, you took part in the economic roadmap exercise representing the private sector, and one of the issues that your group brought up is also to go with the innovate first, regulate later approach, or a negative list approach. In other words, that the government keeps a negative list of things that can't be done and then allow people to innovate and come up with business ideas. Do you think that will happen in the tenure of this government?
Our job is to think out of the box. Our job is to be able to dream, that we can bring about changes, because I truly believe that the way forward is for the private sector to shoulder the responsibility. I truly believe that we need to have economic independence, where we are financially sound as a nation. And I feel that the private sector can bring that about. So therefore the proposals that we've made and put on the table, in fact the innovate first, regulate later, is a very proactive requirement to move forward. And one of the examples I used was David and Goliath. I used that example, and I believe, as a practical person, that a small person can never defeat a larger person if they're both on the same footing. If the larger person is as fast, is as strong, is as intelligent as a smaller person, there's no way that the smaller person can beat the larger person. The only advantage the smaller person has is to move faster and is to outthink the larger person. No. La.
Yes.
So therefore, that is the only advantage Bhutan has. La. Our size.
Yes.
You know, look at the number of MPs we have. La. You know, our parliament can meet within 1 week's notice.
Yes.
We can make decisions immediately. La. I don't think that is the advantage that a lot of our neighboring countries have. La.
Yes.
No?
Yes.
So we need to use our advantage, our size, you know, and if we use it to our advantage, I feel that we can do a lot of things, and therefore the innovate first, regulate later is an integral part of the way forward movement.
So Dasho really gives a very clear idea of the situation using the David and Goliath analogy. But then, on the one hand, being small is the advantage. On the other hand, small doesn't necessarily translate into smart. Smart, which His Majesty has very frequently sort of promoted and encouraged Bhutanese to be. And when you look at this state-private sector tension also, if there's one reason why the state would really want to promote private sector, I think it's for employment. Because the state can't any longer take more and more graduates or school dropouts and to make them civil servants. So they're forced to innovate to make the private sector take the ownership of giving jobs. But then when you look at the human capital, Dasho, is it very promising? Recently I attended this Global Innovation Index meeting online. Bhutan was not even in the list because Bhutan didn't have any data on innovation. It's like Nepal had. So we are in some ways lagging behind the rest of the world, even in terms of human capital. We have a lot of skilled people going out to places like Australia. How would the private sector really grow if you don't have the very fundamental human capital that we need?
There's a role that is important for the government to play.
Yes.
So if you look at a lot of countries, a lot of the innovations took place because the environment was created. Sectors were set up to actually promote innovation. If you look at Singapore, maybe over a decade ago, their bio-research in food research and wasn't so great.
Yes.
But then the government decided that this is one sector that they really wanted to promote. So they spent a huge amount of money, identifying reputable institutions globally, identifying children with aptitude, and they sent them out there. When they came back, they gave them financing. They allowed them to build infrastructure, gave them land, gave them assistance to develop and research on what they had learned. So I think the ecosystem, the environment existed for them to innovate and to do something. So I think the first thing is that we have very smart people. I would say that we Bhutanese are as smart as anyone. We have the knowledge, we have the drive. If we didn't have the knowledge and the drive, I don't think people going to Australia, Canada, New York would be actually surviving there. So they're surviving and they're thriving there. So it means that there is the potential, there is the capacity. But why is it that they choose to go there? They choose to go there because they have an opportunity to use their skills and their knowledge there. So I think what we can do is, in fact, this is a dialogue that has been ongoing quite a lot with the government and the private sector. What we're seeing is that there's this huge mismatch between what is required and the skills that the youth are being given in Seshunibila, and also the education system. What the children are being taught is something that is not required for them to put to use, at least in the private sector. So I am an optimist when it comes to human resource, when it comes to Bhutanese youth, when it comes to what can be achieved within the country. But like I said, you have to look at the history of Bhutan. Dr. Yua, would know the most when it comes to the history of Bhutan. Where did we develop from? Did we have the sense of innovation from the past? A lot of countries had this. Warfare, innovation had to come about. They had to find different ways of doing things. Shipbuilding, industrialization. So innovation had to take place naturally.
Yes.
In Bhutan, that sense of entrepreneurship and innovation, unless it is now encouraged by the government, is not an inherent is not a part of our structure. So I think the government has to play a huge role. And if the government can play a huge role, the private sector is always there to take on the responsibility and the challenges.
Well, sometimes when you look at the situation, so right now we have, according to the government, some 12% youth unemployment, but in reality, I think some 60% of the college graduates don't find a job in the first year after graduation. It's quite staggeringly high.
Yes.
And in the coming years, we are going to have some 11,000, 12,000 young people come out of educational institutions. So to create enough jobs for all of them, and again, the same population not wanting to take up the jobs that are available, it is a horrendous task. I don't know how we can easily solve this. If even we can solve a part of it by bringing back the smart people from the diaspora. And again, we don't have any systems in place right now to bring them back.
Yes.
So I suppose this will be a generational challenge in that the education system may have to change.
I think it's very important.
Yes.
I think what we need to do is we need to be open to ideas.
Yes.
You have international organizations. Singapore, if you look at the Polytech that Singapore has now,
Yes.
it's a diversified program that they have there.
Yes.
But the students who come out of there then are very qualified now. Now, what would be the challenge if we invite Singapore Polytech to come to Bhutan, Bhutan invest and allow them to set up institutions here in Bhutan?
Yes.
For them, it has to be profit oriented. No, it has to be a
Yes.
profit center for them. They're not going to come here and do it for free. So the government has to have that willingness to spend that amount of money.
Yes.
Now, I don't know where the resources will come from, whether it will be done through bilaterally, whether it will be done through loans. I don't know.
Yes.
But at least the willingness to do that. Now, if we bring that, then at least our skill, we can retrain our youth and the skilled people that we have. We can retrain them to the demand that exists within the country.
Yes.
I mean, simple things like construction.
Yes.
Today we have COVID, lockdown, semi-lockdown, construction sector is not moving forward, tourism is not moving forward. So none of these sectors are moving forward. Now, why can't we actually take this as an opportunity? Why can't we say, okay, let's start this retraining of people. So by the end of this 1 year, 2 years, you actually have this huge set of skilled people that can actually get involved in the job markets. So it's not that there are no opportunities. It's the willingness to take advantage and create opportunities, but that willingness has to be there. And sometimes, a lot of people don't look at the journey as this first step forward. They look at the 1,000 miles that they have to cover. So just that 1,000 mile puts them off and they don't even take that first step.
Yes. Now, I think going on from education and youth, as our time is nearly up, Dasho, besides being a business person, you, as Jerry mentioned earlier, you are involved in so many other activities. You are the president of Football Federation, you are also in Chitun Pende, the association working for victims of substance abuse, and you are also the president of Jamchong Tindal Sokpa, and many others, I'm sure, which I'm not aware of, I don't know yet. But how do you sort of bring all these aspects of your life together? How do you sort of coalesce these different aspects of your life and be both a business person and this very active social worker?
Yes. I think this sense of social work was instilled in me when I was in school in Darjeeling. So Darjeeling, North Point was a Jesuit school. And what they taught us, or what they got us involved in, was social work. And that brought about a lot of satisfaction, in helping people. And then when I came back to Bhutan, like I said, I didn't do much to earn it, but I was thrust into a certain position where I felt make a difference. And because of that, I felt that I should not lose that opportunity. That I should use this opportunity given to me and take on certain responsibilities. And at that time, there were certain things that were lacking. There was no structure. In fact, I complained about creation of associations, but actually I am also one of the perpetrators, who was responsible for creating this association, because I was the founding president of APTO, founding president of Motion Picture Association. I was the founding president of Construction Association. And then after that, I love sports, and I felt that so much could be done in sports. So therefore, I took on a lot of responsibilities. Before the president of football, I was the president of basketball, I was the president of cricket, indigenous sports. So I did take up all these responsibilities because I felt that I could contribute. I felt I could contribute and make a difference. And then, we're a small country, and a small effort goes a long way here in Bhutan. We don't have to do too much. If I were in a large country like India, I would have to do a lot to achieve a little. But here in Bhutan, I can do a little to achieve a lot. And therefore, I felt that if I can make that difference, I enjoy this sense of being a part of something and to contribute to nation building. So it doesn't interfere with my business. In fact, it's part of my business growth. That's what I think.
So refreshing to hear that, Dasho, because I've always been talking about social entrepreneurship, business persons being socially engaged in a meaningful way to basically create our own sort of culture of bodhisattva entrepreneurs. And I think, Dasho, you sort of exemplify that in the next way. With so much on your plate, Dasho, what do you do to keep yourself sharp and on top of things? Physically, mentally, how do you keep yourself agile?
Yes.
Any tips for the young audience?
I've been very competitive by nature, Doctor, from a very young age. Of course, there's a difference between competitive, wanting to win, and being competitive as two different things. I always compete to do the best I can. And because of that, sports has always been a very important part of my daily life. So I get to play when of course, prior to lockdown, I play football twice a week. We have a veterans team, and we play football twice a week. And then if time permits, I play golf. And also if, my wife permits, I get to play golf sometimes on the weekday, one day of the weekday, and one day of the weekend I play golf. And other than that, my children, we have a very open relationship with my children, where we debate on different issues. I keep telling my children, who are the youth, who are the young generation of Bhutan, that we cannot have complacent youth now. We have to have youth that are socially aware of what is going on in your country. Of course, video games may be important to you. Of course, parties may be important to you. Of course, a lot of the social activities that you have is important to you, no doubt. But at the same time, as a contributing youth, because I said if we don't have youth that are inquisitive, that question, that ask the government what they're doing and why they're doing it, I said we're going to have, I don't believe that we can have a successful future for our future generations if our youth don't participate in development. So that's why I keep talking to my children, bringing up issues, getting there, so that keeps me also active. And of course, most important of all, what keeps me most alive is my wife.
Nice.
She's after my late father, she's my biggest teacher.
Nice.
She's my biggest teacher.
Yes. Thank you. So kind of social awareness for our young people to really have. And I think that probably will also determine whether we are looking forward to a demographic dividend or a demographic burden as we go forward. Yes. With that, let me invite questions from the online audience.
The first question is from Trishan Rimanga. With regards to forming a private company, I have observed that in terms of investment, there are companies where the promoter's hold over the company is quite high.
But isn't that the natural process of investing in a company? I mean, if a promoter doesn't have the majority share, then he will not be the promoter. How will he manage? you should actually prefer a promoter who has majority share rather than a promoter who has minority share managing. Because if you have a promoter who has minority share managing, you could have a lot of things going wrong because he hasn't invested much and he has a lot more to gain from the company by doing a lot of other things, So it's actually much, much better if a promoter has more invested, because if the company goes wrong, he has much more to lose. Okay, I hope that answers this question.
The next question is from Shap Wangla. Sorry, we are getting it from Facebook. Do we need CTCL?
See, this was a big argument that I had with the government that introduced CTCL. I've always maintained, initially we opposed CTCL. We opposed the formation of CTCL. We said CTCL is not required. But if at all CTCL should be there as an SOE, CTCL should be a pathfinder. They should be innovative. They should go in for new construction technologies. They should sort of almost be the corporation that tries and tests methods that either fails or succeeds. Methods that succeed, they should impart their training to the private sector so that good practices are encouraged for construction. So if at all CTCL should exist, it should be for that purpose, but not to compete with the private sector. This is my personal belief, and was the belief of the private sector when I was the construction association president.
The third question is from Ugen Rangjoki. Bhutan is a net import-driven country. Where does China stand? When we talk about trade and policies, since we do not have any trade or bilateral alliance, but we do import and use Chinese technologies and machineries in every SOE or private sector, what should be the way forward for China and Bhutan trade policies?
Okay, so when you say that you use Chinese products for manufacturing, for all sorts of technology, I think that's not only with Bhutan. I think the rest of the world uses Chinese technology because it is cost efficient, it is has the quality, and also the pricing factor is good. With relations to economic relationship with China, I mean, my personal view has always been we are bordered by our main trading partner, South, East, West. Okay, and we get best prices from them. The market is huge. Our relationship with our largest trading partner goes back, to before we can even remember. And therefore, I'm not saying we should not develop relationships with others. If it is in the interest of the nation, we should, But if it doesn't make sense to do business with someone where I can't sell my products for higher cost, if I can't import my products for cheaper cost, and if there's one trading partner where I can sell my products for higher cost, where I can import things at a cheaper cost, and it makes business sense, then what do I choose as a businessman? I will choose the person who's a better trading partner and who's a better business partner for me, So, like I said, for me that makes more sense.
The next question is from Bandari. Why isn't the private sector not contributing to the 5-year plans? The government rather keeps funding gaps in the 5-year plans, waiting for grants and soft loans instead of considering filling the gap with the private sector solutions.
I see. First of all, the 5-year plans are run not only through grants, but through the internal revenue generation. So internal revenue generation is only through now when you're talking about private sector, we also have to talk about the state-owned enterprises, because that is also semi-private sector. So the revenue generated from the SOEs and the private sector plays a huge role in the 5-year plans. Without the revenue generation from the private sector through direct taxes and indirect taxes, there'll be a huge shortfall in the revenue that is required to implement the 5-year plans. So there is a huge contribution, and every citizen in Bhutan contributes. Doctor.
Yes.
A lot of times I talk to people about taxation, And a lot of times it seems that people feel that no, we don't pay taxes. You know, it's only the private sector. So you want to raise corporate tax to 30%, 25%, 40%, whatever. It's the private sector that pays the taxes, you know, which is not true. Every person that needs to buy every single product within the country pays a tax. And that goes in as indirect tax to the government coffers, which is then spent for the current expenses and for the government to operate. So it is a huge integral part of the fifth five-year plan.
But Dasho, if I may chip in here, while there may be private sector participation through taxation and indirect ways, perhaps the five-year plan, if we continue to have this five-year plan scheme, could bring in private sector also as active program implementers. Right now, program implementation in the five-year plans are almost all state-driven. And there's not much role for the private sector to implement programs and also account their contribution effectively in the national accounts.
No, Doctor, I agree that private sector needs to be involved, but maybe not to the extent that, Doctor, you're stating, because that may be looked on as interference and also sort of almost steer, driving where certain people might want to go or certain people may not want to go. So I don't think that type of involvement would be, so good for, let's just say, the full structure. What I would feel would be actually beneficial is if the private sector is involved in what the government is going to do. A lot of times when annual budgets are declared by governments, it leads to certain sectors either growing or certain sectors taking, a step back. So this is not done here in Bhutan, where we don't become aware whether the government is going to invest a huge amount in this sort of infrastructure development or focus more on tourism. So if we know the sectors that the government is driving towards, then the private sector can invest in those sectors and also be a partner to that development process.
The next question is from Pemala. Do you believe that the private sector is being proactive in serving the ideals Dasho has mentioned? Because of how the general private sector functions reactively and self-obsessed, not thinking much of the community development, the government is creating COEs like CTCL. On the other hand, there are huge data gaps and a lack of information in the private sector. Which is the basis for developing the private sector? What is the way forward here?
Thank you so much. I agree with the question that the private sector has actually been very reactive. I agree totally. They have been reactive, but also, with this term private sector, I would like to understand when people say private sector, what do they mean? Do they mean private sector only the people who are doing big businesses? Because private sector is also shopkeeper. Private sector is also a person who has a small pan dukan, pan shop. All these are private sector. So I think sometimes because they don't know where they're going, where they're heading, that they're comfortable in doing what has been tested. So I keep saying that the onus and the responsibility will fall on the government. There is a way forward. There is a way forward. And the way forward is to trust the private sector, to create the opportunities, and to create the correct and proper ecosystem which gives people the opportunity to do business and take part in business. So there is a way forward, And like I said, I am an optimist when it comes to private sector, because if I was not an optimist, I've been at it for 30 years, trying to promote my views, ideas, arguing, proposing for the last 30 years. And I would have given up by now if I didn't believe that private sector could be the way forward.
Yes. And with regard to the second part of the question about data, again, perhaps it's the state who should do facilitation, regulation, and also keep good data about the entire economic situation and also about data on the private sector.
Yes.
So
but
it should be.
Doctor, most important is direction,
Yes.
And you cannot lead somebody this way and then suddenly say, okay, this way. So if you tell somebody, I'm going camping for 2 days, he'll prepare for 2 days. But on the second day, you tell him, no, we've extended it for 1 more week. Then this person is going to be lost. He's not going to have enough food to eat. He's not going to have the proper clothes to wear. He's not going to have anything. So I think direction is important. And the direction can be either driven by the private sector and supported by the government, or the direction can be given by the government and the private sector can be a part of that process. But there has to be a clear-cut direction. Where are we going? Is tourism sector the most important? If it is, then let every sector in the government be focused on that tourism. Let the financial institutions, let the labor, let the training skills, let everything be focused on that. But if it's not, you can't just give verbal sort of direction. You can't tell people, oh, tourism is very important, but then everything else doesn't support that verbal commitment. So I think it is important for direction to be there.
Yes. But sometimes this over-focus on one specific sector, the PSTC report by Dr. Njuntin highlights is that there was this excessive focus on tourism, that to make tourism work, you have immigration rules which affect other businesses in very serious negative ways.
Yes.
So again, it's tricky in order to get that
No,
balance.
Doctor, I agree. But again, if you look at the tourism policy, it was very okay. Labor, immigration was there to support. It affected others, but then all others. In tourism, you have handicrafts, which is important. You have restaurants, which is important. Tourism is not only about tour operation. Tourism is not only about the tourists coming into the country. It's about all other support. Hotels are important. Infrastructure is important. Horses and mules are important. Restaurants are important. Handicraft is important. Guides are important. So you have to address all these other sectors also. You can't forget all these other sectors and then just focus on, okay, how to bring in the tourists. But because we bring in the tourists, these other things will be curtailed. So if you look at tourism, look at the entire sector and open it up and across the border.
Jerry has a question.
Dasho, I was listening very closely to your comments today, and I really like this idea that you use the word dream. And I think that as we lean in on the 21st century economic roadmap, we need to do some dreaming. And I thought your suggestion about working with Singapore Polytechnic, I really think that's the next level in that type of dreaming. Personally, I also very much agree with what you were saying about developing the ecosystem of entrepreneurship. When I think about missed opportunities, I wonder, have we given enough power and influence to the Gedu School of Business? Very significant institution. So my question is this: if the good luck of this country were to appoint you as the president of Gedu College for the next 2 years, what two or three things you would do in those 2 years to really lift Gedu?
Thank you. I think the first thing I would do is I would get in professionals from outside. There are a lot of professionals that have retired. So you don't have to pay premium prices for them. But maybe Bhutan is an attractive enough place to entice them to come. You have to incentivize in different ways. It doesn't have to be monetary incentives. You could have certain sort of awards or certifications or some titles that are given to people who are actually very, very qualified but are agreeing to come here at a very reasonable cost. Second is, I would definitely relook at the curriculum. I would focus it on being a little more innovative, being a little more where it gives the student the opportunity to explore, to dream. When you give a person a book to write, if you tell him, write a fantasy tale, it's so much more interesting than to tell him, no, I want you to do a thesis on Shakespeare. Of course, that's important. I'm not saying that's not important. But at the same time, I'm sure you get much more people to write that fantasy story than you would get a person to write a thesis. So just like that, I think there has to be an innovation on curriculum for that. And also the third thing is that you have to have involvement of the private sector with how many members of the private sector has been invited to the Gyalpo College to listen to these young boys and girls, not to talk to them, but to listen to them about their ideas, about what they feel can be developed, interesting proposals that they have. I don't know how long Gyalpo College has existed, but ever since its existence, I have not been asked to come there even once. I'm not saying I should be invited, but it would have been very, very interesting if I had been invited. So I would encourage this practice. I would encourage this practice of having open sessions, of inviting not only Bhutanese business people, but do you know that Jack Ma was here, as a tourist, long time back, before Alibaba really took off. People like him have come to Bhutan. A lot of other prominent business people have come to Bhutan. And if you had just spoken to them and said, sir, can you just spend, it's just 2-hour drive or a 20-minute chopper ride. Can you please get you interested in coming there and speaking to our students for half an hour, 30, 40 minutes, 50 minutes? It would have been fantastic. So these are the things that I think I would have tried to institute and propose.
This question is from Dishan Rakin. One argument of having state control over key strategic resources is because corporate bodies such as SMCL pay tax as well as dividends to the state, whereas private mines pay only tax. What is Dasho's take on this?
No, I don't agree with that. I think some of the biggest taxpayers are the Druk when it was looking after the gypsum, SD coal when they were looking after coal, and Jigme mining. The three of them are actually the biggest contributors to with regards to taxes and through dividends. So you have to understand there's these privately owned corporations pay a variety of taxes. SOE, state-owned company enterprises pays. They don't pay the license fee, which the license fee has to be paid by the private company. Secondly, they pay a dividend. Okay, but the private companies pay a dividend and a corporate income tax. There's a double taxation on the private companies. See, I'll give you an example. If there is a mining company that declares profits of say 100, from that 100 they have to pay 30 to the government. Then the balance 70, they keep 20 as a reserve, and 50 is then given to their shareholders. And these shareholders is not one or two persons. It's thousands of people. People have to understand that these big mining companies have thousands and thousands of public shareholders. Now this 50% is divided between the promoters and the shareholders. Now on that shareholding and that dividend, again another 25% has to be paid to the government. So huge taxes comes from these enterprises. So it's not true that the state-owned enterprises pays more dividend and more taxes to the government. In fact, if you really look at the overall taxes paid and the benefit to the government, the privately owned the enterprises pays much more than the state-owned enterprises.
I think overall, Dasho, there seems to be this perception that with private businesses, that the individuals make a lot of money through the profit. Whereas they seem to look at the benefit accrued by the state purely through the revenue that comes directly to the state, and not necessarily all the other impact that a company would have through jobs and through other many force, indirect sort of multiplier effects. So when you look at that scenario, there is a lot of socialist tendency for the Bhutanese to actually go, especially with natural resources, with public companies, because they don't want individuals to get filthy rich. Is there any way to actually level this inequality, this gap, narrow the gap through PIT revisions? Because at the moment, personal income tax is not anything comparable to the big economies of developed countries, no? So
well, Doctor, in a small economy, and when you look at personal income tax, I think there are a lot of nations where the personal income tax is very high.
Yes.
But those are the nations that provide a lot of fantastic services. So they don't have to send their children outside for education. They don't have to go outside for medical referrals, and a host of other things. The public transport is fantastic, so they don't have to invest in really fancy cars. And I'm not saying that should be a criteria for allowing people to pay less PIT. Also, the PIT contribution to the economy is very minimal. So if that PIT contribution was left in the hands of the individuals, that actually contributes much more to the economic development rather than putting it into a non-productive. It would be better to put it into a productive source. But I personally believe that I'm a socialist at heart, Doctor. I believe in distribution of wealth. But at the same time, I don't believe in distribution of wealth where it is the right of a person to demand that without having to work.
Undeserving.
Yes. If you look at Bhutanese private sector, what were we? Our parents and almost 99% of business people today who are considered the elite business people started off in huts. Started off trading in small shops that you see along the streets these days. So they built this up. They worked for where they are today. They should not be given undue advantage. Government should not have a structure which says, oh, because you are a bigger businessman, you are going to get all this and you're going to do all that. But at the same time, you can't have a system where it says, I think you've grown enough, you stop. You stopping you, but you're not allowing the other person to grow also.
Yes.
So I think internationally, everywhere, even in a communist state, even in a socialist state, the system is a pyramid. The system is a pyramid. The pyramid there may not be one person on the pyramid top, it may be a little bit more flattened out on top, But there's a huge base and it slowly goes. And everyone's idea of somebody who's an elite businessman is very subjective. So for a farmer who's doing very well, in his village he's the elite businessman. But for that farmer who's an elite businessman in his village, the shopkeeper in the town is an elite businessman. But for the shopkeeper in his town, he's a Wangchuk person compared to the urban, bigot. So it's very subjective. It's very subjective. For me, I'm considered an elite businessman. But compared to even some of the middle-income business people in India, I'm a Wangchuk person. So it's very subjective.
It's very relative as well.
Yeah, so therefore I don't think the drive and the motive should be looking at who's rich, who's poor.
Yes.
I think the government objective and that is what we're seeing in the initial stages. I said about competing. A lot of times Bhutanese society, we have this crab mentality where we don't like to see the success of others. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but in India, pre-1990, the situation was the same, where business people were not really looked up to, and people actually tried to bring down every business person who was successful. But post-1990, when multinationals started coming in, when a lot of internationalization of business took place, what happened was suddenly they started looking at their business people as role models, as being able to compete equally with global people, and started appreciating them, and that's when they said, no, do more, create more, build more. When Tata bought up UK companies, look at the pride and joy that the Indians had. They didn't say, why is this one person getting more and more? No. So I think the mentality has to change in our country also. I think we have to appreciate, You know, a successful businessman is a businessman that makes money and pays taxes.
Nice.
But in Bhutan, it seems that we appreciate unsuccessful businessmen because we pity them and try to help them. So I think the mentality has to change. You know, and I agree that we should never have a system which allows just few sectors to just keep growing and growing and growing without creating equal opportunities for the masses.
Nice.
I think equal opportunity for the masses. If the bigger business people have to take out collateral, have to pay higher interest, we should have a system where the smaller businessmen don't have to take out collateral and the interest is lower. So we should have this enabling environment to allow people to grow.
Yes. I'm running out of time, but I really wanted to ask you this last question. So I'm all for Dasho's spirit to promote entrepreneurship and enterprise and hard work and make people earn and then enjoy the benefits of their hard work. But then we are opposing people who are undeservingly claiming entitlements.
Yes.
So to poke your socialist tendency, Dasho, now, do you think Bhutan should introduce inheritance tax?
That's a very tricky question,
Yes.
Doctor. It's a very tricky question because how do you differentiate? You know, if we have a evolved society and economy is evolved, I think if it comes to that stage, inheritance tax would be a way to go. Would be a way to go. I'm not saying that I will support it 100%. It would be a way to go. But at the same time, how do you say, okay, you earn so much, so you will have inheritance tax, but you're a farmer living in the village and your land can't be passed down to your child without your child paying a certain amount of inheritance tax. So it's a very tricky question to answer, Sishu because I don't think there can be an across the board. I mean, if it is, it has to be across the board. Inheritance tax means anything that you inherit from your parents or anywhere else, I should pay taxes on it. So there shouldn't be a, oh no, but then if it's this, no inheritance tax. If it's this, inheritance tax. People work hard, doctor. People are working hard to earn. You know, I work hard every day of my life to earn. But I also give back, you know, because I feel that after a certain amount, I don't need more than that. But the purpose of me working is not to make money, at least for me. It is because I enjoy developing, I enjoy creating, I enjoy the process of that. You know, the ends to that means is that I make money. But that's not my purpose. And because of that, I feel that I have to contribute back. So we contribute back, we promote, we donate to social causes. So we do a lot of that. But at the same time, if you have systems where it says how to stop this person from growing, you know, then the environment may not be conducive to
work too hard.
To even the younger generation to say, why do I need to work so hard? When I reach a certain point, then you know everything I work for is going to be taken away from me. So what's the point? You know. Okay, we reach a system where everything is fantastic now. Education, children is taken care of at a very high level, quality level. You know, medical health. Nobody ever has to be referred outside of Bhutan because we have enough facilities and the quality here in Bhutan. Yes, take all my money, You know, I'm happy living. I'm happy living in my country because I think this is the most wonderful place to live. I would never give up anything. Even if tomorrow the government took away everything of mine, I still feel that Bhutan is a better place to live than anywhere else in the world. You know, I'll not sacrifice that for anything. So, but you know, like I said, the work has to commensurate with reward. And if a person works hard, let him benefit from the rewards.
Dasho, thank you very much for a lot of wisdom we got from you. Enjoy the work, and the hardworking person must be rewarded. And I think your specific tips for how to improve the systems in Gedu is very, very practical and effective, I would say. As a university person myself, I really appreciate that. I normally end this session with some traditional Bhutanese sayings, and today I chose this. Porap ki tam gobdalap, poding ki tam diudalap, potama ki tam chapkalap. The best man speaks when needed. The middling man speaks when asked. the worst man speaks behind the back. And Dasho, you have been the best man in always being very candid and bold and frank about lots of issues in Bhutan. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak. Like I said, what Doctor said is I do try and speak my mind, and I hope that I can encourage more and more youth to become business leaders. Like Doctor said, the government cannot provide all the jobs, but neither can the private sector. Neither can the private sector. So we have to have individuals taking up this challenge to become private sector people themselves. You know, take up businesses, take up that challenge, and then contribute to nation building. And that is the way we can have a future for our generation that we can look back and be proud of. You know, I always visualize one thing. What is a Bhutan that I would like to live? When I'm 75 years old, 80 years old, if I'm that fortunate to live that long, sitting in the bench in town, would I be happy to see what has transpired, to see what has developed? Or will I be sad that I wasn't part of trying to make some changes to have a better future?
Thank you.
Thank you.